My sister's wedding was dazzling with lights, chandeliers casting diamonds across the polished floors, gold ribbons fluttering from a massive white tent outside, where a live quartet played near the fountain. The air hung heavy with magnolia and champagne guests, in designer gowns, laughing, toasting, celebrating like peacocks in paradise. But I stood quietly in the corner of the Whitmore Estate ballroom, clutching an old wrinkled envelope. My gift empty, except for a handwritten note. With love from your sister, Emily. All I have right now. I'd saved $3 in my pocket for breakfast tomorrow, the last of my change after months scraping by in Chicago. 8 years ago, I'd packed 2 suitcases and fled Savannah for the city, drowning in debt from caring for our ailing mother while my family polished their image back home. Now at 28 for Chloe, the golden child, and her marriage to Ryan Summers, son of a local developer, their society event of the year splashed across newspapers for weeks. I shouldn't have come. But family pulls you back even when it hurts. At the entrance, a woman in a crisp suit gave me a quick glance, her polite smile freezing. "Are you with the staff?" she asked. "No," I said softly. "I'm family. Emily Whitmore." She checked her list twice, then murmured, "Right this way," her voice laced with pity. Inside, my soft blue dress, 5 years old, from an office party I'd never had, looked faded under the gleam. Conversations hushed as I passed. Whispers followed, "Poor thing. Still alone. She used to be so smart." I forced a smile, spotting the family table and sliding into a seat. Moments later, the wedding planner approached, headset gleaming, expression professional but strained. "Ms. Whitmore, I'm so sorry this table's reserved for the bridal party. There's been an adjustment. We've set a place for you near the service area." I blinked, heat rising. "I am family. Chloe's sister." She hesitated, glancing over my shoulder. Chloe glided over from the head table, radiant in lace makeup, flawless, every inch the poised bride she'd rehearsed since childhood. I started, voice cracking, but she cut me off with a tilt of her head. "Please don't make this awkward. It's my day. Let's not start anything." Before I could respond, my father stormed up, eyes narrowing at the envelope in my lap. He snatched it, squeezed it flat, paper crinkling like my crumbling pride, and tossed it to the floor. "Why did you even come if you have no money? All you ever do is disgrace this family." The hall fell silent. Guests turned stares like spotlights. I bent down, heart pounding so hard it ached, picking up the empty shell. From the head table, my mother's voice cut through, loud enough for all. She should know her place, no money, and still demanding a seat at the feast. Tears burned, but I swallowed them. Chloe looked away. Father returned to his chair. The planner gently touched my arm. "This way, please." They led me to a folding table by the kitchen doors next to waitstaff, in black vests, plates clinking, as the party resumed. I sat there numb, forcing down a sip of lukewarm water. One server, an older woman with kind eyes, leaned in as she cleared a glass. "I overheard them planning," she whispered. "They remortgaged your grandmother's old house, the Whitmore residence, just to fund this extravagance. All for show." The words cracked something inside me. Not just humiliation, but betrayal. That house, co-owned in my name, once now collateral for their facade. I wasn't family anymore. I was the stain they'd scrubbed away. That night, under a sudden Savannah downpour, I slipped out. No dramatic goodbyes, just 2 suitcases waiting in my rented cab. As the estate lights faded in the rear view, one thought burned: I'll come back one day. Not to beg forgiveness, but to claim what's mine. I wanted to ask what I had started. I wanted to remind her of every night I'd stayed up tutoring her, every loan I'd co-signed to help Dad's business, every time I'd been the one cleaning up after the family's messes. But I only nodded. She turned away before I could speak. The planner guided me to a small round table tucked behind a curtain near the catering door. It was set for one. A single glass of water, no name card. I sat down slowly, careful not to wrinkle my dress. Through the gap in the curtain, I could see my parents laughing with Ryan's family, clinking glasses, their smiles broad and rehearsed. Mom's voice carried louder than the music. She should know her place by now. You can't live small and expect to sit with the successful. My father said nothing. He rarely did. He just nodded the same empty nod he gave when signing away things that weren't his to sell. My chest burned. I tried to focus on the music, on the rhythm of silverware, but the words kept slicing through me. I excused myself, told a waiter I needed some air, and walked outside. The sun had slipped behind the clouds, and a fine drizzle began to fall. I stood under the awning watching people toast to love and legacy through the glass windows. For a second, I thought about leaving town that very night, pretending none of it mattered. A young waiter stepped out to smoke. He glanced at me, then hesitated. "You're Miss Whitmore, right?" "The older one." I nodded. He looked uneasy. "I shouldn't say anything, but they told everyone the wedding almost didn't happen. The bank was about to pull the funding. I think your parents used your grandma's house to cover the loan." The rain fell harder. I stared at him. "What did you just say?" He shrugged. "Heard it from the kitchen. Something about an old property they put up as collateral. I think they used your name on some of the papers, too." My mouth went dry. I remembered signing a few forms years ago, back when Dad said it was temporary, just a small loan until his new business took off. Grandma's house had been mine, left to me after she passed. It was the only piece of her I had left. I thanked the waiter and walked away before he could say more. The drizzle had turned to rain. I crossed the gravel path to the parking lot, heels sinking into the mud, my dress clinging to my legs. Through the window, I saw Chloe dancing, her veil twirling like a flag of victory, my mother's pearls flashing under the chandeliers. The laughter inside the tent sounded distant, hollow, like an echo from a life I no longer belonged to. I stood there drenched, staring at the house that once held our childhood Christmases, now filled with strangers toasting to my erasure. I remembered Grandma's words from long ago. "The truth always finds its way back home, sweetheart." That night, the truth began to whisper. As I reached my car, I turned back one last time. The music swelled, the tent glowed, and my family looked perfect. Everything I was told I'd never be. I placed my hand on the cold metal of the car door and spoke to the reflection in the window. If they took my home to buy their happiness, I'll take back everything they built on that lie. The rain washed the last trace of mascara from my face. I didn't cry. Not yet. There would be time for that later. For now there was only silence, the road ahead, and the slow, steady beat of something new rising inside me. Something that felt dangerously close to purpose. By the time I pulled into my apartment complex in Chicago, the rain from Savannah had followed me north, gray and relentless. The hallways smelled like stale takeout and wet carpet. A bright orange envelope was taped to my door. It took only one glance to know what it was. Notice to vacate. I unlocked the door and stepped into the silence of my one-bedroom apartment. The place looked smaller than I remembered. The plants by the window were wilted dishes piled in the sink. I stood for a long time, envelope still in my hand, until the shaking in my chest settled into something dull and familiar. I hadn't paid rent in 2 months. After Mom's stroke, I'd left my accounting job to care for her full-time. She'd passed away 6 months later, and I never quite got back on my feet. Savings gone, credit ruined, family gone too. I sat down at the kitchen table surrounded by unopened mail. Bills, collection letters, one from a storage unit reminding me my grandmother's boxes were still unpaid. I opened my laptop meaning to apply for jobs again, but my hand brushed against the old brown envelope I'd kept for years. Inside were documents Grandma had left me, her will, the deed to her house in Savannah, a few yellowed photos. The will had my name written in her shaky handwriting. To my granddaughter Emily, who knows the value of hard work. I flipped through the papers until something caught my eye. The copy of the property deed looked different. There was an additional signature, one I didn't remember seeing before my father's, dated 2017. My heart pounded as I searched my email archives for old correspondence from that year. That was when Dad's business had collapsed. I remembered him calling late one night asking me to sign a temporary authorization form so he could restructure a small loan. I'd been tired, half listening, trying to balance client spreadsheets while he talked. He said it was nothing, just paperwork to show collateral for a few months. But that same year was when I'd stopped receiving the property tax letters. They'd started going to my parents' address instead. I called the county clerk's office the next morning. After 10 minutes on hold, a woman told me politely but firmly that the property had been transferred to C. Whitmore and fully refinanced under her name. My sister. I hung up before the woman could finish her sentence. I stared out the window at the street below, cars gliding through slush. For a long time I couldn't breathe. Then I started laughing, short and bitter. They hadn't just humiliated me at the wedding, they'd erased me on paper years ago. I called Dad's old number, disconnected, Chloe's number, straight to voicemail. That night I went through every file in my cabinet, loan agreements, tax returns, bank statements. I highlighted dates, circled signatures, filled the floor with papers like pieces of a crime scene. The deeper I looked, the more wrong it felt. At 2 a.m, I called Jill, a friend from my old firm who'd always been too honest for her own good. She sounded half asleep, but listened quietly as I spilled everything. They used my name to transfer the house, I said. They promised it was temporary. Emily, she murmured, her voice steady. If they took your name, your property, and your dignity, you have two choices. You can cry about it, or you can make the law work for you. I don't even know where to start. You do, she said softly. You're an accountant. You know how to follow a trail. Start there. I didn't sleep. When dawn broke, I made coffee strong enough to sting and opened my laptop again. I searched every public record I could find, cross-referenced tax filings, pulled archived loan documents. The more I dug, the clearer it became. My signature had been copied onto at least 3 separate forms. Same handwriting, slightly off. Someone had traced it. By noon, the fury had cooled into focus. I made a list: contact legal aid, verify deed authenticity, gather financial statements. Step by step, the plan began to take shape. But late that night, as I sat in front of the computer, the screen flickered and a new message appeared in my inbox. No subject line, no sender name I recognized. The body contained only one sentence. They didn't just take your house. I froze. My finger hovered above the delete key. The timestamp said 2:47 a.m. No attachments, no links, just that line. I checked the address, nothing traceable. A string of random letters. Someone new. I stared at the words until they blurred. The apartment around me felt colder, smaller. Every instinct told me to ignore it, to sleep, to forget. But a part of me couldn't. I printed the email and pinned it above my desk next to Grandma's deed. Then I took a deep breath and whispered into the empty room, not as a promise, but as a warning. If they thought humiliation was enough to break me, they were wrong. Outside, the city lights glowed through thin curtains. I sat there listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the faint drip of the faucet, the quiet pulse of my own heartbeat. I didn't know yet who had sent that message or what they meant, but for the first time since the wedding, the ache in my chest was replaced by something sharper, cleaner. It wasn't anger anymore. It was purpose sharpening into resolve. Somewhere between the silence and the glow of my computer screen, I realized what I needed to do next. Find out exactly what else they had taken. The next morning, I packed what little I had left into the trunk of my car and drove south until the skyline of Chicago disappeared behind me. I didn't have a plan, just a direction. Atlanta felt far enough from everything I'd lost, yet close enough to start over. Finding a job took longer than I expected. Most firms wanted perfect resumes, not a woman who had left work to care for a dying parent and carried the quiet stain of financial ruin. After 3 weeks of rejection, a position opened at Greystone Property Group. The ad said junior accounting clerk. The pay was terrible, but the office was small, quiet, and anonymous, exactly what I needed. I worked late every night, sorting endless stacks of loan documents and mortgage files. Numbers were the one thing that still made sense. They didn't lie. They always told a story if you looked closely enough. That was how I met Helen Porter. She was in her 50s, a widow who'd spent 20 years as Greystone's in-house counsel. Everyone said she was hard to impress, impossible to please. The first time she saw me cross-checking figures against scanned deeds, She stopped at my desk and asked why I bothered with records no one else cared about. Because mistakes hide in the footnotes, I said. She studied me for a long moment before nodding. The next week, she started leaving folders on my desk with sticky notes. Find the inconsistency, she'd write. It became our unspoken routine. I learned about transfer errors, fake signatures, and fraudulent refinancing. Some nights, she'd pull up a chair beside me, sipping black coffee, while explaining how one misplaced comma could change ownership of a house. One evening, she said quietly, "It's not just numbers, Emily. Paperwork is where people bury their sins." I didn't tell her how true that sounded. Months passed and my work became sharper, cleaner. I rented a small studio apartment near Piedmont Park and spent weekends at the Public Records Office combing through online databases. It started as practice. Then I searched my grandmother's address. The file history was longer than it should have been. Multiple loan applications under A. Whitmore. I clicked through them, my pulse racing. Some were stamped, refinanced, others released. Every single one was dated after the year my parents said they'd paid off the debt. I printed everything I could find and kept the papers hidden at home. Every line felt like confirmation that I hadn't imagined it. They had forged my name, maybe more than once. Helen noticed the dark circles under my eyes and asked if I was sleeping. I told her I was studying for certification exams. She smiled, faintly unconvinced. But she didn't press. Instead, she invited me to join her on an internal audit project. It involved a property dispute between two partners. It was the first time I saw how evidence could dismantle a lie. I watched Helen cross-examine a contractor, her voice steady as stone, her hands calm. He broke in less than 5 minutes. Afterward, she looked at me and said, "The law only works for those who know how to use it. Remember that." That night, I wrote those words on a sticky note and pinned it above my desk. Over the next several years, I saved every bonus, every overtime check. By year 4, I had enough to register a small consulting firm under my own name. I called it Havenstone Holdings. It sounded solid, untouchable. I specialized in recovering properties lost through fraudulent transfers. At first, it was just paperwork for small clients, elderly homeowners, single parents. But every case taught me more about how easily people could lose everything they owned to someone else's deceit. I worked quietly, never publicized my name, never gave interviews. Success came in whispers through referrals. I preferred it that way. Silence was safer. Sometimes I checked on my family out of morbid curiosity. The local papers mentioned that my father's new construction venture had collapsed again. Chloe and Ryan were facing foreclosure on their suburban home. The same pattern repeating itself, greed disguised as ambition. 8 years after I left Savannah, my life had finally steadied. My office overlooked the city, the air smelled of coffee and paper, and I'd stopped expecting apologies from ghosts. I thought maybe I could live the rest of my life without ever hearing their names again. Then one night, while going through emails before closing my laptop, a new notification appeared from a real estate auction site I used for clients. The subject line read, "Foreclosure listing, Whitmore residence." For a second, I couldn't move. I clicked it open. The description was brief, almost clinical. Single-family colonial 4 bedrooms, 2 baths, starting bid $290,000. The address stared back at me. The house on Telfair Street. My grandmother's house. I stared at the screen until the numbers blurred. 8 years of running, and the past had found its way back into my inbox. The next morning, I went to Helen's office. She was reviewing a contract glasses perched on the edge of her nose. I placed the printout on her desk. "That's the house I told you about," I said quietly. "The one they took." She read the page, then looked up at me. "You're thinking of buying it?" "I don't know yet," I answered. Her eyes softened. "Sometimes justice doesn't knock. Sometimes you have to open the door yourself." I nodded, unable to speak. That night I sat in my apartment, the auction timer ticking down on my screen. I thought about Grandma's laughter in that kitchen, about Chloe's smirk across the wedding table, about the look on Mom's face when she pretended not to know me. When the clock hit midnight, I placed the bid under Havenstone Holdings. The confirmation email arrived seconds later. My reflection in the laptop screen was calm, almost unfamiliar. The game had changed, and this time I wasn't playing by their rules. The day the sale closed, I drove back to Savannah. 8 years had stretched between me and that town, yet the highway felt exactly the same. Flat, endless, lined with pines that whispered like old gossip. I parked a block away from Telfair Street, watching from the car window as the house came into view. It looked smaller. The white paint had peeled into long curls, the porch railings rusted at the joints, and one of the upstairs windows was cracked. A realtor's lockbox hung from the doorknob. For a moment, I just stood there on the sidewalk, my breath uneven. Then I unlocked the door with the code they had sent me. The hinges groaned like something half asleep. Inside smelled of dust and rain. Sunlight filtered through torn curtains, revealing furniture outlines where nothing remained. I walked room by room, my shoes stirring thin clouds of dust, and everywhere I looked, there were ghosts. Grandma's sewing chair. The kitchen tile where Chloe spilled paint when she was 10. The narrow hallway where I once waited for my father to say he was proud of me. He never did. I ran my hand along the wall, tracing invisible cracks, then whispered, "I'm home," though the word didn't sound right anymore. Later that afternoon, I met Helen at a small cafe downtown. She had driven down from Atlanta to help finalize the purchase under Havenstone. Her calm, deliberate presence steadied me. She asked if I was ready to see the bank about the old records. I nodded. We finished our coffee and went straight to the branch that once handled my father's accounts. The banker, a man in his 60s with tired eyes, scanned the system. He frowned, hesitated, then called in a supervisor. They whispered briefly before asking if I had ever opened an offshore account. My pulse quickened. I told them no. He turned the monitor toward me. On the screen was a record from 2016. Cayman National Bank. Account name, A. Whitmore. Balance, $180,000. The last activity was 4 years ago. I stared at it until the numbers blurred. The banker asked if I wanted to file a fraud report. I said I'd handle it privately. My voice sounded steady, but inside something cracked open. That night, Helen and I sat in her hotel room surrounded by papers. She worked on her laptop while I spread out copies of tax forms and scanned bank statements. I asked her if someone could open that kind of account using another person's name. With enough access. Yes, she said. Birth certificates, social security numbers, tax IDs. It happens more than you'd think. She showed me how to trace email trails through archived servers. We spent hours comparing metadata, following digital crumbs, until one message stood out: a conversation between Linda Whitmore and Ryan Summers. Attached was a file labeled Tax Adjustment Request 2016. Helen opened it. The words blurred for a second, then sharpened into something unmistakable. It was my tax return, my signature, my address, and an authorization letter transferring financial responsibility to a joint entity, Linda and Ryan. The email read, "Let's move it offshore before she notices. Use her name for consistency." My stomach clenched. Helen muttered something under her breath and started typing notes. She told me we needed to authenticate the document chain, verify timestamps, and preserve everything for potential legal action. For the first time in years, I felt cold rage instead of grief. They had used my identity, my credit, my name. While I'd been scraping rent, they'd been wiring money under a signature that wasn't theirs. Over the next several weeks, I became obsessed. I pulled every document, printed every form. I compared signatures, highlighted discrepancies, matched loan numbers across databases. At night, I'd pin the papers across the walls of my office, mapping their deception like a detective in a crime show. Helen warned me not to lose myself in it. Evidence is powerful, she said, but so is obsession. You have to decide what you want at the end of this. Justice, I said simply. One morning I visited the county records office to verify the old deeds. The clerk looked up at me with curiosity. "Your family's name is all over these files," she said. "They moved a lot of money for a small-town business." That comment stayed with me. Maybe it wasn't just the house. Maybe there were other assets tied to my name, hidden under layers of paperwork. I spent that week digging into old shell companies registered to Whitmore Enterprises. Some led nowhere, but one account kept resurfacing: the family trust. The name alone made me want to laugh. It appeared on several loan transfers, some signed by my father, others by Chloe. When I checked the registry, the trust had been dissolved 2 years earlier due to insolvency. The contact address listed wasn't theirs. It was the same P.O. box my parents had once told me to use for family correspondence. The realization hit like a shiver. The money in the Cayman account, the fake tax forms, the family trust, they were all pieces of the same web. And my name had been the thread holding it together. That night, I returned to the house. The air was thick with humidity. The floorboards creaked under my steps. I walked into the empty living room and sat where Grandma's piano once stood. The wind slipped through the cracked windows, carrying the faint scent of magnolia and salt. I closed my eyes, letting the weight of everything settle. For years I had blamed myself for being weak, for trusting them. But now I understood. They hadn't just taken my home. They had stolen my identity, my credibility, and almost my belief in truth. I whispered into the darkness, not out of anger, but certainty. I didn't just buy back a house today. I bought back the truth they tried to bury. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere over the river. I sat there for a long time, listening to the sound of it fade, until all that was left was the hum of the old ceiling fan and the quiet rhythm of a plan forming in my head. The past was still here, scattered in ledgers and signatures, and I was finally ready to hunt it down. The next morning, I opened the blinds and stared out at the street, the light sharp and unfamiliar. Savannah had always looked gentle from the outside, but now every corner seemed to hide a shadow. I had spent years running from ghosts. Now they had faces and signatures. I called Ryan Summers that afternoon. His number was still saved on my phone from long ago, buried under contacts I never thought I'd use again. The line rang 6 times before he answered. His voice was rough, uncertain. Emily. I didn't give him time to recover. I told him I'd bought the house on Telfair Street, that I had proof of fraudulent transfers, and wanted the truth. Silence stretched for several seconds, then he sighed. "Meet me tomorrow," he said quietly. "Noon at the coffee shop on Liberty Avenue." When I arrived, Ryan was already there, looking smaller than I remembered. He had aged fast. The expensive suits were gone. His shirt sleeves were rolled, collar frayed. There were deep circles under his eyes. He stood when he saw me but didn't offer a handshake. I sat down, keeping my voice even. "I'm not here for revenge," I said. "I'm here for information." He laughed, dry and humorless. "Then you came to the wrong person." I waited. He glanced around the cafe like someone being watched, then leaned forward. "They forced me to sign the documents," he said. "Your mother and Chloe. After the wedding, the company started to crumble, and they needed collateral to secure new loans. Linda said if I didn't help, she'd ruin me. Ruin you how? She said she'd tell investors I'd falsified statements that I'd been stealing. It wasn't true, but she could make it look that way, and she had proof she'd forged herself." He rubbed his temples. "I didn't even see the offshore transfers until it was too late. By then the family trust was already set up." I asked what that was. He hesitated, then reached into his bag and pulled out a flash drive. It contained backup records, transactions, moving money between my parents' accounts, and a charity fund registered in Delaware under the family trust. Each transfer was disguised as a donation. Each document bore my mother's signature. "You kept all this?" I asked. "I kept it to protect myself," he said. "But you deserve to see it too. You were their cover." I thanked him. He didn't look relieved, only resigned. As I stood to leave, he said softly, "I tried to warn Chloe once. She said it was none of my business. Then she filed for divorce." Outside, the air was humid, heavy with exhaust and regret. I drove straight to Helen's office in Atlanta, my fingers gripping the steering wheel until they hurt. Helen studied the documents for hours. When she finally looked up, her expression was grim. "The family trust is fake," she said. A shell company used to hide unpaid debts. Your mother's signature is authentic, but the founding documents link it to a now-defunct business registered in your father's name. None of it connects to Havenstone, so they used my name to make their fraud look legitimate. Exactly. It's a classic layering scheme. Legal on paper, criminal underneath. She leaned back in her chair, folding her hands. If we take this to the police now, they'll open a federal investigation. But once you file, you lose control of the narrative. I thought of their smug faces at the wedding, the laughter that followed me out the door. Not yet, I said. I want to see how far it goes. Helen nodded. Then we do this quietly. You document everything. Chain of evidence matters. If you make one move too soon, they'll bury it again. For weeks, I lived between spreadsheets and silence. Every day I found another clue, loan statements forged, contracts, phone logs. I matched signatures until I could spot Linda's pen pressure blindfolded. Late at night I wrote timelines and taped them on my wall, each red mark leading back to one thing, the family trust. When I wasn't working, I returned to the house. Fixing small things helped me think, replacing broken windows, painting the porch rails. It was a strange comfort to rebuild what they had abandoned. Then one Friday evening, my phone buzzed. A local news blog had posted a rumor an anonymous company purchased the Whitmore family estate. The article speculated it was a rival investor. By the next morning, everyone in Savannah seemed to know. I told Helen and she sighed. It was bound to happen. Secrets don't stay quiet forever. That afternoon, I received a call from a number I hadn't seen in years. I almost didn't answer, but something in me wanted to hear her voice. Emily, it's your mother. The sound of her voice was soft, controlled, as if rehearsed. She said she'd heard about the house. She said she forgave me for the misunderstanding that had torn the family apart. If I came home, we could start over. I let her talk, her words circling like perfume, sweet, cloying, suffocating. When she finally paused, I said quietly, "Start over. After you erased me. You're being dramatic. We did what we had to do. For yourselves, maybe." There was a long silence. Then she said the thing that chilled me most. "You're my daughter. I'll always forgive you no matter what." I almost laughed. It was the same tone she used when I was a child, caught telling the truth she didn't want heard. I ended the call before she could say more. My hands were steady as I placed the phone down. Helen called later that night, worried. I told her about the conversation. She was quiet for a moment, then said, "They're afraid. That's good. It means you have the upper hand." But power wasn't what I felt. It was clarity. I stood by the window looking out at the dark street, the reflection of the house faint in the glass. For years I had chased their approval, their version of family. Now I understood that love built on control wasn't love at all. I picked up my phone again and scrolled to Mom's number, hovering over it for a moment before deleting it. My voice was calm when I spoke into the empty room. "Not this time. I don't need permission anymore." The next day, I opened my laptop and started preparing for the final move. The evidence was ready, the timing perfect. The truth was no longer hidden. It was waiting to explode. The night of the gala arrived wrapped in humid air and the kind of tension that hums under silk gowns and polished smiles. The hotel ballroom sparkled in white and gold, a monument to everything my family valued. Appearances, applause, the illusion of power. A banner stretched across the stage, 30 years of legacy. I stood in the back, hidden among the crowd. The black dress I wore was plain compared to the glittering sequins and tuxedos around me, but that was the point. No one looked twice. My badge read, Havenstone Holdings Gold Sponsor. My hands were steady. Helen sat near the middle of the room, quiet and watchful. She had confirmed with the IRS field officers earlier that day. Everything was set. Linda took the stage first, flawless as ever, her hair swept high, her pearls shining beneath the lights. She began to speak about family endurance, community trust, the Whitmore legacy. Her voice was smooth, practiced, and everyone clapped at the right moments. I almost admired her composure, the way she could sell virtue like a product. As she spoke, a tech assistant moved behind the projection booth, pretending to adjust the slides. I caught Helen's subtle nod. The screen flickered once. Then the audio began. Linda's voice filled the room, but this time it wasn't rehearsed. "No one will ever know," she said, a cold laugh underneath. "She's too scared to talk." For a moment, the audience thought it was part of the presentation. Then the silence fell deep and sharp. Heads turned. The lights dimmed slightly. On the screen appeared a grainy, time-stamped video. Linda in her study papers spread across the table. Ryan's voice off-screen. "Move it through the trust," he said. Linda leaned forward, signing the form. The name at the bottom was clear. A. Whitmore. Gasps rippled through the room. A woman near the front dropped her wine glass. Chloe stood pale, trying to reach the stage. "Mom, stop it," she said. "Turn it off." But the next video began before she could move. Linda's voice again brittle with arrogance. "It's not theft if it's family. She won't fight us. She never does." The words echoed across the ballroom. Cameras flashed. Reporters at the back of the room started filming. The hotel manager rushed toward the control booth, but Helen intercepted him, flashing her credentials and a quiet warning. I stepped forward slowly through the rows of tables. Every eye followed me as I reached the aisle. The spotlight swung and caught me mid-step. For the first time in years, I didn't shrink from it. Linda froze on stage, color draining from her face. She tried to speak, but her microphone hissed and died. I said nothing. I didn't have to. The evidence spoke louder than any accusation. Helen raised her phone slightly, signaling the agents at the edge of the room. Two men in dark suits entered quietly, moving toward the side of the stage. One whispered something to Linda before showing her a folded paper. She glanced at it, her mouth tightening. The color left her completely. Chloe started crying, half in disbelief, half in fear. "What do you want?" she said, her voice trembling. "Money. Our name back." I met her eyes. "No," I said softly. "I just want the lies to stop." The room buzzed with whispers. Photographers snapped pictures. On stage, Linda staggered, catching herself on the podium before crumpling to her knees. Chloe knelt beside her, shouting for help, but no one moved. The illusion of power had finally cracked, and no one wanted to touch the broken pieces. Helen joined me near the exit. "You should go now," she murmured. "The agents have it from here." As I walked away, the air outside hit cool and clean against my skin. Through the tall windows, I could still see the chaos inside, the flashing lights, the microphones, the end of an empire. For a moment, I expected to feel triumph. What came instead was quiet. Back at my car, I sat for a long time, hands on the steering wheel, watching the city lights blur through the windshield. My phone buzzed with alerts, news headlines, social media notifications, videos already uploaded. The Whitmore scandal was trending. The first headline read, "Whitmore family under federal investigation." The second, "Estranged daughter behind corporate expose." I stared at the screen until the words stopped meaning anything. Somewhere deep down, I still felt the pull of old habits, the urge to call, to explain, to apologize for something that wasn't my fault. But that part of me was dying now, fading like smoke. When the phone rang again, I let it buzz until it stopped. Then I turned the key in the ignition and started the long drive back to the house. The night sky stretched wide above the highway, heavy with stars. The wind moved through the open window, carrying the faint smell of salt and rain. I thought of my grandmother again, of her saying that truth has its own clock. It always shows up late, but right on time. When I reached Telfair Street, the old house stood waiting in the moonlight. I parked in the driveway and stepped out, the gravel crunching under my heels. The porch light flickered faintly as I unlocked the door. Inside, everything was still. On the table sat the folder of evidence I'd prepared, now no longer needed. I touched it once before closing it and putting it away. The fight was over, but something told me the war wasn't. As I walked through the empty rooms, the silence felt different, less like loss, more like space waiting to be filled. For the first time in years, I let myself breathe deeply. But before I could turn off the lights, my phone rang again. This time, the caller ID made me pause. "Helen." Her voice came through low and steady. "The IRS confirmed the seizure. It's done." "But Emily," she hesitated. The agents found something else in the records, a secondary trust account, one none of us saw. It's still active. My stomach tightened. Whose name is on it? I asked. She exhaled slowly. Yours. The line went quiet except for the hum of static. I looked around the darkened room, the shadows stretching long across the floor. The past, it seemed, still had one more secret left to tell. I barely slept that night after Helen's call. The house felt alive, whispering with every creak. Somewhere in the dark, my grandmother's portrait hung crooked on the wall, its glass reflecting the faint pulse of streetlights. The words still echoed in my mind. A secondary trust account, still active, in my name. By morning, the news had exploded again. Every channel showed the same footage from the gala. Linda's face frozen mid-denial, Chloe's tearful breakdown, the agents escorting them away. Reporters called it the fall of the Whitmores. To me, it was simply the end of pretending. 2 weeks later, the federal court scheduled the preliminary hearing. I flew to Washington with Helen, the evidence sealed in her leather briefcase. The courthouse loomed gray against the winter sky, the kind of place that swallowed sound. Inside, the air was cold and dry. Linda sat at the defense table, her wrists free, but her expression rigid like marble about to crack. Chloe was beside her eyes, red hands clasped so tightly they trembled. She wouldn't look at me. When the judge entered the room, fell silent. Helen's calm voice filled the space as she outlined the case: identity fraud, financial laundering, misuse of trust accounts. The documents we'd gathered laid out everything in black and white. The recordings were undeniable. The defense tried to frame it as a misunderstanding. Family transactions. Linda said, her tone clipped. I never meant harm. It was just confusion among relatives. Helen didn't even look up as she replied. Confusion doesn't open offshore accounts or forge tax forms. The gallery murmured. Linda's jaw tightened. For a moment, I almost saw fear behind her eyes. Then it vanished. She turned toward me and spoke, her voice low but sharp enough to cut through the silence. You've destroyed your own family for money. I didn't respond. There was nothing to say that truth hadn't already covered. Ryan testified next, his shoulders hunched as he confirmed her threats and the creation of the family trust. His words were soft but steady. Chloe followed. She hesitated at first, glancing between her mother and me. Helen handed her a folder containing the bank statements, the forged documents. When Chloe saw her own name among the signatures, something inside her broke. Her voice trembled. Mom, stop this. Please, it's over. Linda turned on her, cold and furious. Sit down. But Chloe didn't. She looked directly at the judge. Everything in that folder is real. I saw her sign those forms. She said no one would find out. The courtroom went silent. Linda's face drained of color. I looked away, not out of triumph, but something closer to grief. After a recess, the prosecutor approached Helen and me with an offer. A plea deal. 5 years in prison for Linda, full restitution of $300,000 from the seized accounts, and closure of the remaining investigations. If we refused, the trial could drag on for years. Helen looked to me. The decision was mine. I thought of Grandma's kitchen, the smell of cinnamon and soap. I thought of my father's quiet nods and the way he'd always avoided choosing sides. And then I thought of the letter Helen had mentioned during discovery, one written by my father before he died. She hadn't shown it to me yet, said the timing hadn't been right. Now she slid the envelope across the table. I opened it slowly. The handwriting was his, uneven but certain. He wrote that he had transferred money years ago to clear my student loans, using a small trust fund he'd hidden from my mother. He wanted to protect me, he said, but Linda had found out and taken control of it, turning it into another piece of her scheme. I stared at the page until tears blurred the ink. He hadn't been perfect, but in his quiet way he had tried to save me. Helen touched my shoulder gently. You don't have to forgive her, she said, but you can choose when to stop fighting. When the judge returned, I stood. My voice felt foreign but steady. Your Honor, I accept the plea. Linda exhaled sharply as if she'd won something, but when the sentence was read, 5 years imprisonment, full restitution, her composure cracked. She turned to me, her words a hiss only I could hear. "You ruined everything." I met her eyes. "No," I said softly. "You ruined it the day you started lying to everyone, including yourself." She looked away first. The bailiff let her out as cameras flashed in the hallway beyond. When the room emptied, Chloe came to me, her face streaked with tears. I wanted to tell her that it wasn't her fault, that she still had a chance to live differently, but the words stuck. She whispered thank you and left before I could answer. Helen gathered her papers quietly. Outside, the afternoon light had turned pale dust motes drifting through the tall courthouse windows. We walked down the steps without speaking until Helen stopped near the street. She studied me for a moment. "You know, she said winning in court isn't the same as peace." I nodded. "I think I'm ready to find out what peace actually feels like." Back in the car, I sat for a long time watching the traffic move slowly past. My phone buzzed again and again with notifications, but I ignored them. Somewhere deep inside, the anger that had fueled me for years began to loosen its grip. What replaced it wasn't relief exactly, but something gentler. That night, I returned to Savannah one last time. The air smelled of rain and jasmine. From the porch of the house, I could see the lights of the city blinking faintly in the distance. I thought of everything that had been lost and what little had been reclaimed. The truth had cost me nearly everything, but it had also set something right that could never have stayed buried. As I stood there, the wind moved through the open doorway, carrying the faint echo of my mother's voice from somewhere far away, still trying to explain, to justify. I closed the door quietly. For the first time, her words didn't follow me. A year passed before I realized I had stopped waking up angry. The mornings in Savannah were quieter now, the air softer, the light slanting differently through the trees. The house on Telfair Street no longer looked like a wound. The porch was repainted, the windows restored, and inside the walls echoed with new voices, women laughing, working, rebuilding. We called it the Haven Project. What had once been a symbol of betrayal became a place where other women could start over. Some had been defrauded by spouses, others cut off by families who controlled every dollar they spent. We helped them untangle paperwork, reclaim bank accounts, and learn to stand again. Helen managed the legal aid program. I handled the finances. Together we kept the doors open with grants, donations, and the stubborn belief that broken things could still be useful. On most mornings, I met the residents in the kitchen for coffee before they headed to job interviews or classes. Their laughter filled the same space where silence once ruled, and every time I heard it, I knew the house was breathing again. One afternoon in early spring, a familiar figure appeared at the gate. Chloe stood there holding a stack of papers and a shy smile. Her hair was shorter now, her makeup simpler. I hadn't seen her since the sentencing. She looked at me as if waiting for permission to enter. I wiped my hands on a rag and opened the gate. "You came a long way," I said quietly. She nodded. "I'm studying law at night. Helen said you might need volunteers for the outreach program." I studied her for a moment, then stepped aside. "Come in." We worked in silence that first day, sorting old donations and repainting the back office. Later, we went outside to plant 2 young magnolia trees by the porch. The soil was damp and cool, the scent of earth heavy in the air. As we worked, she said softly that she had visited Mom in prison. "She wanted me to tell you she's sorry," Chloe said. I didn't look up. For what I asked. For everything. For you. For me. I pressed the dirt around the roots and stood brushing soil from my palms. Maybe that's something she'll have to tell me herself. A week later, a letter arrived at the Haven Project. The handwriting was familiar, small, and careful, like she was afraid the words might spill. I read it sitting on the front steps while the afternoon light turned gold. She wrote that prison was nothing like she had imagined, that it stripped away everything false, leaving only what you feared most about yourself. She said she thought of me every day, that I had been right about one thing. Lies destroy slowly. At the end she wrote, "You won, Emily. But the hardest thing for me isn't losing. It's realizing I loved you wrong all these years." I read it twice, then folded it back into the envelope. The anger that used to burn hot inside me didn't rise. Instead, there was a kind of ache that felt almost peaceful. I took a match from my pocket, struck it, and touched it to the corner of the paper. The flame caught small and bright. I watched it curl and blacken until the ashes drifted up into the warm air, disappearing over the roof. Helen found me later sitting on the steps, the air still smelling faintly of smoke. She didn't ask what I'd burned. She only said that sometimes forgiveness is quieter than justice. I nodded. By summer, the Haven Project had its first feature on local television. A reporter filmed the women gardening, laughing, studying at the long table in the sunroom. The segment aired under the headline, "The Woman Who Reclaimed Her Worth." I hadn't expected the attention, but donations poured in afterward. For once, being seen didn't feel like exposure. It felt like closure. One evening after the story aired, Chloe and I walked down to the beach. The tide was low, the sand cool beneath our feet. She carried 2 seashells and placed one in my hand. "For Grandma," she said. I smiled and tossed it into the waves. We stood there a long time, the wind moving through our hair, the horizon fading into dusk. For the first time since childhood, we didn't need to fill the silence. It was enough to exist side by side, breathing the same salt air. I looked out at the ocean, at the endless stretch of water reflecting the last light of day, and spoke softly more to myself than to her. 8 years ago, they cast me out because I had nothing. Today, I own the house they once traded away, not to live in it, but to give others a place to begin again. Chloe turned to me, eyes glistening, and for the first time, I saw not guilt, but understanding. We walked back to the house as the porch light flickered on warm and steady. Inside, laughter echoed down the hallway, the kind that comes from people who believe tomorrow will be better. Before I closed the door for the night, I looked once more toward the sea, feeling the pull of its rhythm. My voice came out barely above a whisper, but the words felt like they belonged to every woman who had ever been silenced, dismissed, or underestimated. If anyone ever tells you that you are nothing, remember this. Your worth is not in what they gave you or took from you. It's in how you stand up again after they tried to break you. The wind carried the words away, scattering them like seeds across the dark water. I let them go, knowing they would find someone who needed to hear them. Then I closed the door, and for the first time, the house truly felt like home.